In this, uh, good morning from Iowa. In this file, I'm going to give you a challenge to explain what I'm creating with this file and what I'm doing with it. And so this is kind of an extreme modeling file, and there's things about it that I would definitely like to modify and create, but it's a basic setup that I have. And so I have two main things. I have these rocks that are going on along a path, and then I have this grass that is growing not on the path. And if you notice, the rocks fade away as it goes into the grass, and the grass gets smaller as it gets closer to the rocks. And so there's a little bit of overlap where we have uh, not a clean break, but there's a little bit of overlap between the two where the rocks get smaller into the grass, and the grass is also growing in between the cracks of the rock, or sort of in between the cracks of the rock, not exactly. And I want you to explain this image this for me, but I'm also giving you the Houdini file. And so I have a Houdini file, and I have a couple of parts to it. I have this uh, texture trace section. And if we were to go into there and I go to scene view, and I want to make sure I have hide other off, I have a curve object. And so this curve object is viewed from the top, and it creates this curve. And the curve object, if I do a render view, it has its own render node, and it's called curve texture. And it renders this path. And so I have a curve. I did some editing of the point positions. I did a conversion of the type just so that it gives it more detail. The curve type is originally a NURBS curve, which is good for drawing curves. So it's a great tool. But then I wanted to get more detail and more control over it. And then attribute wrangle, I had a couple of methods. So you need to explain what's the difference between this p-scale and what the difference between that p-scale is. And I have them both in the same expression, which is nice. But then I can control which one I want to use by using comments or not using comments. Okay. Then, so this gets, I go to the output part of Houdini. This texture gets rendered to disk, and it's version dependent. So remember that if you upgrade your version, which I have already done, I'm on version 8 of Houdini, and the version that you get, I think, is version 7. So when it renders the disk, it's going to render the version name in with it. So I have this texture that I rendered to disk. And so that's one part of the file. The second part of the file deals with the factory. And so let me go to the imperfect factory, and we'll do a little bit of a test render of that. And that gives us everything that's in that other part of the file. So I'm just going to hold down the shift key and draw a small box over an area and zoom into that part that's getting rendered with higher detail. So here we see the grass growing away from the path. It's higher the further it's away from the path. The rocks are actually getting smaller as they grow into the grass. And so there's a bit of overlap going on in there. And I'm going to stop the render, go back to scene view, and let me just look with a space 1 to get a perspective camera. It's basic. Okay, so here's my geometry, and it's loaded. There's a lot of data in there. And lawn grass has some variation to it, and it all kind of looks the same, but it all kind of looks different. And so I have that in this setup. Now all this takes place inside. So I have this geograss, and that's the basic, the dirt underneath the grass. And we'll look at my render out in Perfect Factory, my render objects. I have the ground, which I just turned off, which is basically the dirt underneath the grass and the rocks. And then I have everything else under this imperfect factory. So under the imperfect factory is both the rocks and the grass. So if we go back here and we go to imperfect factory, we see I have this basic setup. And so what happens down here in the bottom is that I have grass coming in and I have rocks coming in. And I assigned material to the grass and I'm assigned material to the rock. This one is called material rock. This is one that's just called material one. And there's a disadvantage for doing this because let me show you that what happens if I go to my, let me add it right here since we're here, material type. Geometry spreadsheet. So here I'm on point, and I have all these attributes. I have points, I have color, I have a seed, I have normals, and I have UV. And yeah, okay, there you go. But then if this is on the point. If I go to vertex, I have nothing. It's just a vertex connecting. And here I have something that's can be pretty dangerous. And so, and I want to show you that the advantage or disadvantage of creating data. And so sometimes this is necessary, but this is can be a common thing in Houdini where you create unnecessary data, which makes your geometry larger and more complicated than it needs to be. And so whether you want to have one digital asset or two digital assets, or how you want to manage your digital assets so that they are the most efficient as possible. And the way that I did it here, it's inefficient. I want you to think about the way of modifying it so it becomes more efficient. And so basically what I have is that every primitive here, there's, if I click on that, so there's a lot of primitives. You can see that there's like 100 and, oh man, just too many. So a lot of primitives, each one of these primitives has this information on it. This is for the material assignment. And it's all the same. If I click here, it's going to give me the beginning, going to give me the end. So everything is loaded up with that information, but it's not necessary. It's just too much. So let me go back to that window, and I got to go back to not my geometry spreadsheet. Okay, there we go. And so how do you solve that problem? How do you get rid of that problem? And I included notes in the email. Let me just pull it up here. Okay, and okay, that's the old one. Let me pull up my email that I sent you. Sent. Oh, here we go. And I'm sending it to you right now. So haven't sent it yet. So we have these questions. So just go through these questions. And I did put the link or the path. And Houdini, it shows us the path. And so these paths kind of get you close to where the question is. Sometimes they're not the exact path, but it's kind of the part of the setup. So the path that I created, a geometry path thing, you explained what's going on there. And then I have kind of two things going on with that, where I created a path, but also I made a model out of it. Now, this question number 5, this model geometry is not used in my setup. It's an alternative to what I did. Okay. And so I want you to go study through the file. So 2 parts. One is what's going on with that trace path thing. And the other one is what explain the questions of my imperfect factory, the grass and the rocks. I only ask a few questions, but you're going to be discovering a lot more. Rather than ask you a lot of questions, I just thought I'd ask you a couple of significant questions. But you're definitely going to be learning a lot more as you go through this. And the reason why I haven't sent this email yet is I'm also going to include just the link to the drive. Oh, well, it's going to be in there. So I have a drive folder for you, and this video will be in there. It's not in there yet. So I'm going to go ahead and hit the send button right now, and that'll be in there in a moment. And I don't need that. So done. I'm done. And let me go back to my Houdini file. So this setup, it's split up, and I did a lot of copy stamping. And I have a copy stamp for the grass, and I have a copy stamp for the rocks. And I have all these things going on in here. And I want you to be able to understand and explain what's happening with this. Now, this is the reason why I picked grass and rocks is that there's a lot of subtle variation, which ends up resulting in something that looks more natural, but it's subtle. And so, in creating any kind of realistic object, sometimes the difference between the one and the other one next to it is subtle, but because there's so many objects, the difference is subtle. This concept can be included into modifying geometry where, let's say you have a window where the window is made up not one polygon for the glass, but four polygons for the glass, kind of made up of triangles with one point in the center. And you just push that center point in and out just a little bit. And it's enough that when it gets hit by an environment map, that slight variation in the point is enough to vary the reflection map so that your window doesn't look flat. It looks bent and curved, but it's a minimal amount of geometry. Okay. And so that here in my setup, I'm doing all this subtle variation. So um, we'll talk about this in our class, but I want you to go through this and to be able to explain. And so if I ask you what is this doing or what is that doing, you'll be able to tell me what it is. Good luck with this quiz.